Welcome to State of Mind. This is Julian. If you are watching the video of this, you'll see that I'm wearing a suit. And the reason for that is just that I wanted to. And sometimes that is a great reason to do something. I realize it's been a few weeks, I think 3 weeks since I released a podcast episode. Part of the reason for that is I just completed a intensive 10-day retreat, meditation retreat here, and then immediately following that jumped into a training called the Psychedelic Sitter School, which is offered by an organization called Medicinal Mindfulness based out of Boulder, Colorado here. And there's a really great, powerful training about how to hold space and work with plant medicines, in this case, cannabis as a psychedelic sacrament. If you make it towards the end of this podcast conversation, you will hear me sharing a bit more about that experience. So I think I'm going to talk about this meditation retreat and this training with psychedelics more in an upcoming episode. But they were, it was very powerful, and I feel grateful that I got to do both those things and that I got to do them together like that. As I'm sure you are all aware, we had a tragic shooting happen, kind of mass shooting at a grocery store here in Boulder. And so there's been a tremendous amount of grief and upset. And, I work full-time as a psychotherapist here, so it's certainly affected everyone here. I think it affects everyone in the country in different ways, but when it happens kind of literally in your own backyard, it certainly takes its toll. And I don't really even know what to say about it now, other than these kinds of tragedies have unfortunately become commonplace. And while it is a shock for it to happen so close to where I live, it is not a surprise that it happened, because it seems like they happen quite frequently. The week before there was a mass shooting in Atlanta, Georgia. So I just wanted to offer part of my process around this. Like, when I first heard the news, I reached out to people I knew, made sure they were safe, and then there was a kind of numbness, actually. I think, like I just said, because it's happened so often, there's a kind of blocking of feeling the impact of it. And so I then took a walk in the woods with my dog. It was snowing, it was cold, I was alone, and I really opened up and intentionally let myself feel and be with all the emotions, all the feelings, all the thoughts around this. And that is part of the power and beauty of mindfulness, to be able to do that, to be able to honor what has happened, to feel it on a body level, to feel the emotions without being overtaken by them, without being overwhelmed by them, and without ignoring them, and then also to think about it deeply. I was recently interviewed on another podcast called Bootstrapped in the Trenches, if you want to check that out. And I get to share about my approaches to mental health and therapy and coaching and some of these mindfulness techniques and how they can be helpful. And I shared that, one of the original uses of the word meditation in the English language and in European culture was to think deeply about something. And so to actually consciously engage your logical, coherent thought process and really think about a subject can be good. And that's very different than the kind of compulsive, obsessive, habitual thoughts that tend to buzz around in the back of our head that we tend to push away. So to actually engage with something consciously. And so I made space to do that in this case, and I'm glad I did. And so I just wanted to offer some tools like that, and also to honor the memory of those who died, and that it's a big deal, and we shouldn't let ourselves be numb. We shouldn't accept that reaction. In today's episode, I am speaking with Kyle Buller. He is the co-founder and director of education and training at Psychedelics Today. Psychedelics Today, you can go to, psychedelicstoday.com. It's a great organization. They have a great podcast, and they have a ton of information on their website. And they're also offering trainings. You may be surprised to learn there's so much to learn about the subject, and that was part of what we discuss in our conversation. We really cover a wide range of topics. Kyle shares with us some of his own personal story of a near-death experience he had when he was 16 years old, and his first experience with psilocybin mushrooms a few years later, and how it helped him to understand and resolve some of the trauma from that near-death experience. And that led him to this calling to be involved in the world of psychedelics. We discussed some of the history around transpersonal psychology and Stan Grof, we talk about things like the DMT work from Rick Strassman and ego death, and then we discuss this concept of right use, in contrast to overuse, and different ways that could be understood and looked at. So this was a great conversation. I really hope you enjoy it. Kyle is a wealth of knowledge on this subject. I would go so far as to call him an expert. He has been doing this for over 5 years professionally, and it was a real pleasure to have him on. So without further ado, I give you Kyle Buller. And I'm here today with Kyle Buller. Kyle, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Julian. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And so you just told me let me say this right, co-founder and the director of education and training at Psychedelics Today, right?
Correct, yep.
Do you want to kind of tell people a little bit about that? It's a really cool, you've got a great website, great podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Psychedelics Today, we're an education media and an education media platform. And we have been going on for about 5 years. I think our 5-year anniversary is in May this year of 2021. And we put out 2 podcasts a week exploring all sorts of different aspects of the psychedelic world, covering the news and kind of business aspects in our Friday episodes and any research updates. And then we usually have on special guests on our Tuesday episodes to really dig into their work. And then we also provide education. So one of our flagship courses is an 8-week program educating clinicians and therapists and coaches and really anybody that's working with clients on the psychedelic world. So really, I like to say just getting people psychedelically literate. I know this is a new growing field, and we get a lot of people have had no experience in psychedelics, but they have clients coming in talking about wanting to microdose and they know nothing. So really trying to provide a foundation for that. And then we've also had researchers and people that are actively, doing high level psychedelic work join our classes, and everybody learns a ton. It's fun.
And you're teaching those yourself? Okay.
Yep, I teach it with Joe Moore as well, and then we invite guest presenters in every once in a while, and so it's a hybrid course. We have a lot of pre-recorded material, and then we meet on Zoom for an hour and a half for 8 weeks to discuss the material and to dig into conversation, have like Q&A.
That's awesome. Yeah. 5 years. I'm just struck by that you started Psychedelics Today 5 years ago. I mean, it's certainly a kind of a new field, I guess we should call it that at this point. But I'm thinking like 5 years ago it was even more. I mean, it's still pretty edgy. It's kind of out there. It's certainly like a lot of taboos and controversies, and we're kind of figuring this all out. And I think our society is changing so much around all this. But 5 years ago it was even more kind of on the edge, right?
Definitely.
Can you speak to that? Like, what have you noticed over the last 5 years?
It's really boomed, and I'll even go back further. So I got started on this path, really studying it probably in 2008, I would say, around 2008 probably, after having some really profound experiences that just really got me to dig into it. And, I needed to, I guess, try to figure out my own experience at times. And I ended up at a school studying transpersonal psychology around 2010. And I went in there with the intention of studying psychedelics. And, it was interesting going in there to a transpersonal psychology program that, they have the field of transpersonal psychology has this kind of psychedelic roots with Dr. Stanislav Grof. And it still felt edgy, like people are like, what are you interested in? What are you studying? Is there going to be a career for you? Like, this is, not legal. And, I just had to really follow my passion and my interest. So, it's really blown up in the past few years. I remember going to a lot of different conferences back then, And they're really small. Like the big conference, like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They had a conference in 2013. I forget the numbers. It was maybe around like 600 people. And then the following conference in 2017, I think they doubled the numbers. Maybe there was around like 1,300 people.
Yeah, and I was at that one. And
oh, nice.
It blew me away. I had no idea the number of researchers and presentations and the number of people and the excitement in the air. And that really changed the course of my life in some ways, because I realized this big wave was coming and how excited people are. And I think one thing I remember thinking about this as I left that conference was just the excitement and enthusiasm felt so palpable and kind of like an unstoppable force at that point.
Yeah.
And like there's just like the world that we live in, like, you know, if someone has a passion for something, like whatever it is, mountain biking or climbing or, you know, building little toy train sets out of matchboxes, I don't know what like that passion is like what so many of us are looking for and wanting. And so there's something about psychedelics where people get like really passionate about it, and that's carrying this, like, it feels like this wave to me.
That was the thing that really connected me with like going to those conferences and meeting people early on. It was like just trying to find other people, and I was really blown away by the passion in a lot of these folks. It's like, hey, we're all kind of like hiding in the closet, coming together to these events, and you just see so much passion and excitement about, you know, this field and what could possibly come of it.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing you spoke to is like you're studying this. Like this is a field, it's a subject that you could study for years, decades, a lifetime at this point. I mean, I think a lot of people aren't used to thinking about it that way, and I think that perception will change. But I think it's really intelligent of you to create a course for people to learn more, because there is so much, and there's a lot we don't know. But
there's tons we don't know. I feel like we're just at the beginning at times. You know, there's a lot of research that happened in the 50s and 60s, and then there's a little bit of research that happened up to the 70s. But yeah, I feel like as this, you know, new wave hits, there's so much to explore. You know, new research protocols, you know, just a lot of innovation that could really come out of it if we take that beginner's mind. But also, you know, really honor the history too, that these aren't new substances for the most part. Well, at least like the plant-based psychedelic substances, they've been around, they have tradition, right? They have, you know, years, maybe thousands of years of some sort of lineage behind their use. Yeah.
It's interesting for me. I just kind of want to note, like I remember learning about like Stan Grof and transpersonal psychology, you know, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years ago, like, kind of reading about it, learning about it, and like having this sense of like LSD was a big part of what Stan Grof was doing, and then he stopped and developed holotropic breathing. But there was like this sense of kind of like delegitimizing all that, and that it was like this craziness of the 60s, and that it was something we had kind of grown up from, and that it was dangerous, and all these taboos, which I think it's just really worth mentioning, because people feel these and they affect us so deeply, like even on a felt somatic level and emotional level. The taboos and messages we get as kids growing up about what's good and what's bad, there is a power to them that is deeper than just our logical mind, you know.
Yeah.
You could learn, you know, it's just, so I think. And now it's kind of coming back around, and it's just interesting to observe and feel that on the society level of, there was a lot of research done. I think a lot of it was good. In fact, my grandparents were scientists, and they had a friend who was also a scientist who studied the effect of LSD on spiders and how it affected the way their spider webs got made. So I remember as a kid, the adults like joking about this, and I got out this old dusty book with these black and white photos of spider webs. And
wow, is that like the famous pictures of like the spiders with alcohol, cannabis, LSD?
You know, I don't remember. I wish I should, next time I go home, I should try to find that book. But I know it involved giving LSD to spiders.
Fascinating. That's cool.
And their webs were not. They didn't look as good.
No.
Not a good result. But who knows what the spider's perspective is? But,
yeah, exactly.
So let's see. I guess I wanted to, yeah, ask you about your story. You shared a little bit about it with me, but you kind of like, how did you get interested in this in the beginning?
Yeah. It's whenever I reflect on it, I always kind of skip over this one part. So I was like 15. I started to get a little bit into meditation, and I picked up this book called Snowboarding to Nirvana. And it was about somebody that went over to Nepal. They ran into this monk. They taught him transcendental meditation. So I started picking up some techniques there, and it was really interesting. So I read that around, I was a freshman in high school, and I had to do a book report on it, and I read that around like winter break. And then the following winter break, when I was a sophomore in high school, I went snowboarding on New Year's Eve, and I always, I guess, kind of make this joke that I ended up snowboarding to Nirvana that night to some degree. So I got in a really bad snowboarding accident. I was going around a turn really fast. I grew up in New Jersey, so I was out in the Poconos and kind of small mountains. So my technique was always to go fast and just straight down the hill. But I was going around a turn, and I was night skiing, and there was a mound of snow in a blind spot. I couldn't turn. I couldn't really do anything until I was up on it. And I hit that mound, flew through the air about like 30 feet or so. The nose of my snowboard took most of the impact. My shoulder hit, and I heard a loud pop, and I thought, well, I broke a rib. And it was immediate pain. I was grunting, screaming. I couldn't breathe, and try to make the story shorter, on the shorter side, and go into a lot of detail with it. But they ended up bringing me down to first aid, thankfully. I was on the mountain for about 45 minutes, and they said, you look really pale. Your pulse is really low. Your ribs are fine. You don't have any sort of bruising. Doesn't look like anything's broken. But, since your vitals look really low, we think you have internal injuries. And at that point, I wasn't very religious, but I started praying, and I said, God, if you're out there, I don't want to die tonight. And that was the first thing that popped in my head as soon as I heard, we think you have internal injuries. I just thought, oh shit, I'm going to die tonight.
It's scary.
Yeah. So luckily, they saw that and knew it was an emergency. So they medevaced me out and got me to a hospital quickly. And when I got there, things started to really unfold in an interesting way from a consciousness perspective of like consciousness studies. The room started to expand. I had my uncle standing next to me. He was a first responder for the town. And so my dad called him to tell him that I was going there. So he's by me the whole side. And I just had this like really interesting thought of like, where I'm about to go, I can't take this person. And this is somebody I consider family and close to me. But, I'm about to embark on a journey by myself that I can't take anybody with. So at that point, death didn't really cross my mind too much. It started to become much more blissful in a sense. And I could hear the doctors and the nurses kind of freak out. I remember them jabbing me with IVs. One nurse said, I can't get an IV in, his veins in his upper body are collapsing. And I heard another nurse say like, I can't get a pulse on him.
Are you in pain at this point?
I was in a lot of pain still. Yeah. And, I'm also being like kind of blissed out, cooperative. I'm like trying to take my snowboard boots off for them, but also, my consciousness is starting to expand. And, it's like I'm feeling all the energy and the anxiety in the room. And, they told me that, listen, we need to figure out what's going on. We're going to do a sonogram on you. They did that, and they found massive internal bleeding. And so they reported that. They said, listen, like you probably feel really sick. This is the reason why you feel like you probably want to puke and why you're in so much pain. It's because you have so much blood in your abdomen. You have massive internal bleeding. So they said, we need to get you to a CAT scan machine ASAP to see where this bleeding is coming from. So while I was in the CAT scan machine, this is when things like really started to go a little bit deeper, I guess, on this near-death experience. I felt like I was on the other side of the room with the doctors. And then there was like this golden white light. It felt like it was around me. And there was a voice that kind of came in. And I don't know if it was like an external voice. It felt like more of a telepathic type of voice, like there's just something communicating to me. But I just remember hearing, "You're going home. You're going back to the stars where we all come from, and this physical life is going to cease to exist, but you're going to continue onward, and this is just a transition." And the more you struggle with it, the harder it's going to be. So learn how to relax into it, and this transition will be easier. And at that point, all I kept thinking about was, I'm going home. This is going to be amazing. And it felt like this is what we all wait for. And so it felt very blissful, very beautiful. And they took me out of the CAT scan. You know, they're yelling at me, "Yo, don't fall asleep, Kyle. Don't fall asleep." And I'm just, you know, kind of in this like state of, I'm freezing. I have no blood circulating through me, and I'm in so much pain. The only thing I could think about was to fall asleep. But they took me out and told me I ruptured my spleen and they needed to do emergency surgery. And I think I remember everything up until them telling me they were going to give me anesthesia. And the last phrase I heard was, "Should we use a straight razor or an electric razor?" And then I remember just kind of blacking out. But, you know, I woke up from that experience just really rattled. It definitely impacted me on a psycho-spiritual level. It felt like I went somewhere. Felt like I had like new new information. And it was just, it was really difficult to sit with as a 16-year-old.
That's amazing. Yeah, it sounds like a real, like you said, near-death experience, and then you went under with the anesthesia, and then you came out, you woke up, and then you were not in that near-death experience anymore. You're kind of back to normal, so to speak. Is that?
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if they hadn't given you the anesthesia, like how your experience would have been different.
Well, you know what's interesting was the thing that like bugged me the most was when I woke up, it felt like, you know, I kind of make this metaphor that it's like I woke up with a map on my chest. It was like, here's, you know, your new map of reality. And it really kind of just like, it just messed with me psychologically and emotionally of like, what just happened? Where did I go? It felt like I talked to something, or I talked to somebody, and somebody gave me all this new way of seeing the world. And it was like I didn't have any visual context for it. And so, you know, years later, I was reading Dr. Rick Strassman's book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule. And I think I remember reading, when people are having a near-death experience and anesthesia is given, the visual hallucinations are sometimes suppressed. And so that always stuck with me of going, I wonder, if I didn't get anesthesia during that time, would I have had the tunnel of light meeting some sort of entity type experience that you typically hear? But, you know, just that experience with his voice coming in saying, "You're going home, you're going back to the stars." I mean, that in itself, you know, really has stuck with me. And, you know, I don't know how to explain it. It's just a feeling, a telepathic type of thing.
I mean, obviously, when you describe that voice and remember it now, it's something very different than the normal thoughts you have, right? Like
totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, thanks for sharing. Like, when you think about all that now, how do you have a way that you kind of understand or explain it, or are you still kind of in the mystery?
I'm still in the mystery of it. You know, I've definitely done like a lot of like investigation, you know, researching near-death experiences. I went down the DMT rabbit hole of, you know, reading Dr. Rick Strassman's book and this whole DMT hypothesis. And
has that been proven, that this idea that when you're about to die, DMT is released endogenously and from your pineal gland, right? Like your third eye opens up or something?
You know, there's not a lot of research because it's like a tricky thing to study, right? Like, how do you find levels of DMT in the human pineal gland? I think there's some ethical considerations there. So, you know, something I remember in 2010 when I saw Rick Strassman talk at the premiere of his documentary. I was at Cosm at Alex's Gray's studio up in New York. That was one thing he said was like, you know, that was a hypothesis and everybody kind of took it as truth and kind of ran with it. So, you know, I know Dr. David Nichols has presented a talk at Breaking Conventions that's up on YouTube, trying to like, you know, put put another narrative out that there's a whole cascade of like chemical reactions that are happening in the brain when you die, and is the DMT hypothesis legit? I think the answer is we don't know, but
Yeah.
yeah, I
wonder if like this idea of it coming from the pineal gland. Do you know how that idea got started? Was it just a...
Yeah, Rick was studying, I think, melatonin and the pineal gland. And I think he talks about just being really interested in spiritual experiences. He writes about how he got interested in the research in the beginning of DMT, the spirit molecule, if anybody wants to check it out. I don't remember his exact story, but I think it started with melatonin research, something he was doing. Maybe he was doing research in Alaska. I could be wrong about that, but it started with melatonin in the pineal gland.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, skeptics will say when in this kind of discussion, like all these near-death experiences that have been documented, like the person hasn't actually died, so that there's this threshold of actual death that we actually don't know about, and yet we do have cross-cultural accounts, like so many now that have been studied from all over, of the tunnel of light, like the kind of exactly like what you're describing. Yeah, it's amazing. Who knows? I mean, yeah, I kind of like being in the mystery too. Who knows? But
yeah, I have no idea.
It certainly seems like that those accounts open up a door to understanding the world, spirituality, and religion, and what makes a living being different than a robot, or whatever fancy computers we have. They probably don't have an angel visiting them when they're about to get turned off for the last time.
Yeah,
there's some... Yeah, anyway.
No, it's fascinating, and I think about it pretty often, and it is interesting with some of the accounts that people have, like died. I don't know if you just saw, there's a documentary that just came out on Netflix that presented near-death experiences.
I heard of that. I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
But yeah, there was one woman that got turned over on her kayak, and I think she was dead, and had this whole experience. So yeah, I mean, there are those experiences where people don't completely die. Like I didn't completely die. I was on the brink of death. They said I lost about 5 to 5.5 pints of blood internally. So they said if I came in 5 or 10 minutes later, I would have been pronounced dead on arrival. So I was, on the threshold there.
Yeah. We don't have to get too much into it, but there's what is it? That new book came out, The Secret Religion, about how psychedelic sacraments may have been used historically in different religions, and that the experience of ego death that you can have through the right set and setting, and possibly entheogen or substance, to touch into a place of where you're no longer afraid of death, or a sense of the deathless. And I was telling you before we started recording, like I had Mike Crowley on the podcast, so that this word Amrita in Sanskrit literally translates as like the deathless potion or something like that. So yeah, it's just a lot of interesting connections, and it's interesting to think about. And I've shared on the podcast before, I had one experience in my life where I had like a full DMT experience, and I had the sensation of blasting off, breaking through, and I think one of the best ways I've heard it described, because I know I'm not alone in this kind of experience that it's possible to have, of like almost like when you restart a computer and the screen goes blank, and like, and yet there was a sense that there was a tremendous amount of experience that I then don't remember, in the same way that maybe when we don't remember being 1 year old or 6 months old. Like it kind of had that kind of quality,
Yeah, it's almost like too much information to like assimilate or like
maybe,
comprehend. I don't know. I've heard like theories like that too. It's like the ego just like can't comprehend what just happened, so it kind of blanks out a little bit.
But then, and definitely a sense of like kind of disappearing or leaving and then coming back, a kind of rebirth. And I understand 100% that how destabilizing that can be. By its nature, it's destabilizing. And so one of the things I've tried to do on this podcast, and I think you've done on yours, with your work, is like talk about these things responsibly and have like real warnings, coming from a place of compassion and care, not from judgment, but that we actually need some amount of ego strength and a sense of ourself to function in the world. And it makes sense.
We definitely do.
Yeah. So if you overused things like this, it could destabilize your sense of who you are and like how the world works, and because you're constantly destroying or seeing through, or like, I think one way to talk about psychedelics is they break apart our conceptual categories, which is amazing to be able to do that, because we tend to live in these conceptual boxes, like we're in these prisons in our mind. And yet, if you did that too much, like you don't want to step in front of the bus coming down the road, like that kind of, yeah, that's a conceptual thought, and it's also like a reality that would not be good. So
yeah, and I think this is a topic that I often discuss, is just the whole topic of spiritual emergence and emergencies, and overuse kind of leading to that. But and I think that's like a shadow side of like part of the psychedelic culture. There's like this saying like that Terence McKenna really kind of put out there of like 5 dried grams in silent darkness, and that's the way to really do it, to kill off the ego and to have that heroic dose. But I think having a healthy ego structure also helps you to go into those spaces, and helps with like part of the integration process afterwards, because then like what happens when you don't have an ego when you come back? I mean, that is really destabilizing. And it was funny to hear like Terrence in a talk, talk about ego and how ego is healthy too. It's like his example was like, ego tells me to put my food in my mouth when we're out on a date and I pay for you, versus like, oh, whose mouth am I putting the food in? Who's what, Yeah,
that's a funny example.
Yeah.
Well, while I have you on the podcast, can you give some advice and thoughts about like kind of right use? And like we just mentioned that term overuse, and I get that it's like a very individual thing, but as we open up this conversation, more and more people are interested in these substances and in exploring them, kind of like giving this caveat, like you wouldn't want to overuse it, but like, do you have any like recommendations like specifically for people?
The term right use is really interesting. What is the right way to use a psychedelic? I don't know if we actually know. So I like to come back to this idea of use contexts, so the context of use, and really kind of viewing, why do people use substances to begin with? And can we just educate around responsibility and respect around those different use cases, right? For example, like when I really started off on this project, I was coming from a very spiritual and therapeutic orientation. And I would say that's right use. It needs to be done in a certain setting. It needs to be done either with a professional. It needs to be done with these certain parameters, because these are very powerful and they deserve respect. On my journey with this podcast and talking to so many different people, I find that people get benefit in different use cases. I mean, a perfect example right now, I'm not advocating for this use, there could be potential harms, but, the people that go to festivals, lots of people find so much healing in connecting with others and dancing, and just thinking about right now, in this time when we've lacked so much connection in the past year, how healing could that be to be in a place where, you might be a little bit more open, maybe you're able to connect on like a heart level at times, and to connect in a big group like that, connect with music, listen to music in a new way, that's healing for some folks.
No, absolutely. I really appreciate you naming that.
Yeah, so the term right use, I don't know. Yeah, it's been interesting to even see my shift in that over the years of saying like, I think we need to box it in to therapy or very, traditional use cases, and then really listening to people over the past few years and seeing this more multidisciplinary approach and saying, well, can people just have these experiences and really respect the power of it? And, is there a right kind of context for it? I think there's, think as long as you respect it and you understand the power, the potential dangers, people can have really healing experiences. For example, I was at a retreat and I was helping to co-facilitate, and my my orientation, there was somebody that got up, and my orientation was like, all right, how do I get them to focus back on themselves? And, they're here to do inner work. And, I checked in with them and said, yeah, how's it going? And they said, oh, I actually don't want to focus on any of that stuff. I'm at the age where I'm kind of sick of processing it, and I really just want to connect with people.
Yeah, beautiful.
And that hit me. I said, wow, connection is healing. And, why does it always need to be a therapeutic process as well? With eye shades, internal or whatnot.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And to be able to have choice and to be able to offer that, and also to speak to the benefit of going internal, having the eye shade. Like if you set up all those conditions, it's pretty rare, and to take advantage of it, because resistance can come up, and it can be worth working through that. But to your point, yeah, I really do agree. I worked at an addiction center for a year, and the whole time I was like trying to understand addiction, and I was researching it, and I started to look into this question, like, why do people take mind-altering substances? And what I kind of found was, who knows? But like, it's like an innate part of humans that's found across the world in every culture. So it's almost like, why do we have sex? Or why do we like to eat special food? Or why do we like to listen to music? Why do we like to dance? Why do we make art? Why do we do podcasts? Why do we take substances? Like, it's just part of being human. And so I don't want to cut off a part of what it means to be human and judge it. I think we can make informed choices. And so I agree. I think the word, like the idea of right use, can include connecting.
Yeah.
And then I gave I don't know, I kind of wrote my final master's like thesis project, whatever it was. And it was like about this idea that connection can help heal addiction. Like that addiction is a process of disconnecting, covering up that disconnection, moving away from ourselves, from others, from the environment, from what we're putting in our body. And so, yeah.
That was like Johann Hari's like kind of phrase too, right?
Yeah,
like the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yep, you got it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I think, just to go back on that idea of overuse, I mean, that definitely is a problem at times, right? Like, it does lead to potential harms. It does lead to destabilization in a person's life from time to time. And so that is a real consideration to take into account, of saying, like, is somebody using a psychedelic too much? What are they looking for? I mean, then you can get into that whole conversation about spiritual bypassing, not actually doing work. And, is their life getting better, or is it having some sort of negative consequence on their life?
Right.
And those are important conversations to have too, because it's not all light and beauty and love within the psychedelic realm. There's darkness in there. There's shadow that emerges. And we have to be honest about that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, what was I going to say? I think holding these substances as sacred, however you conceive of that, however you do it, is a way to prevent against overuse, because it's a way of, we're kind of talking about respect. You use that word respect, so like having a lot of respect for it, which kind of comes naturally when you have a big experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those big experiences humbled the crap out of me. I don't know if I ever want to touch this ever again.
Yeah. Well, to kind of circle back, you shared your story about this almost dying, basically, right? And how did that lead to your interest in psychedelics? Was it because of that was a kind of altered state and trying to explore your own mind more?
Yeah. So I think it was around 19. I think it was 19. A friend of mine, I was struggling with a very heavy existential crisis. My depression really kicked off. I was on a pretty big high after that accident, but then reality started to set in, and I started to see the world in such a dramatic, different way. And it was really hard to contain as a teenager. Like, most of my peers are, worried about some of the social aspects and, experimenting with drugs, having sex and this and that. And I couldn't understand why people were doing certain things. And probably because I had this big experience, and now I'm coming back down to earth, and I'm like looking at things through a different lens. And it was very existential. And there was a part of me where a lot of, I guess, like I thought of dying pretty often, and increase in suicidal ideation.
Mm.
And I didn't know about it then, but it wasn't until I had the psilocybin experience I started to shift my I guess beliefs about it. But I mean that existential despair was a wanting to go home. Like I wanted to go back to that blissful state that I felt. This life felt too hellish. This
Wow.
life felt too hard. That experience that I felt when I was leaving my body and going home, that felt real. That is where I wanted to be most of the time. And
Yeah.
so, for a few years, I was really struggling, and a friend of mine had some psilocybin mushrooms, and we went out into the woods. I didn't know anything about them really. I think I had like one small dose experience with him beforehand. It definitely did not prep me for this experience.
Mm.
And I had some friends that experimented in high school, and they didn't report anything that I just experienced in this. So yeah, I was 19. I wasn't really thinking about it in an intentional way. I really was going into this experience to want to escape because I was having a lot of these thoughts. And I'm not condoning, if you're listening to this and you're feeling that way, I don't really condone this. That's a good mindset to take these substances in. Like I've definitely learned a lot throughout the years, and I was pretty naive. I was 19.
Yeah. There's a magic that comes from that being naive at that.
Totally,
That.
totally. Yeah, not knowing anything, like I wasn't really doing research on it. I didn't
Right.
know, I didn't hear about these healing experiences. I just was like, let's take it. Like I think I was experimenting with cannabis back then, so I had some sort of, state with some sort of experience with a non-ordinary state. But so as this experience started to come on, it was really, really challenging. I mean, I watched my friend puke his up. I'm starting to have like really bizarre thoughts. I can't like grasp onto reality. Reality just feels like sand in between my hands. Of like every time I think I'm on reality, it dissolves, it changes into something else. Yeah, and after I watched my friend puke his up, I go, oh my God, like maybe these weren't like, magic mushrooms, maybe they're poisonous. I'm starting to have all these like
Oh, yeah.
all these thoughts. And we were hiking through the woods, and I just started feeling so sick. I said, I think I need to sit down. And I found this little rock in the middle of this trail, and I said, I'm gonna die here. So all this panic started to come up. I was afraid, and I felt this feeling that I felt before.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, the world started to have teeth, and it was like mouths. I mean, this was a bad trip.
Wow.
Everything became dark. It felt like the world was going to consume me. And the world did consume me. It tore me into shreds, and I blacked out, and I entered into this dark void of nothingness. I didn't know my name. I didn't know anything about myself. I couldn't remember what day it was, couldn't even remember what year it was. I knew nothing. It was utterly confusing and terrifying. And then I started to have this transpersonal experience where I went beyond that dark void, and I started to travel through these like star systems. And then I came to this wall and started to peer back, and I saw these entities, these two small entities appeared out of nowhere. And I said, oh my God, I feel like I've been here before. And telepathically, these just looked at me and said, thousands of times. And I said, holy shit, like if I've been here thousands of times, then this must be the death bardo. Like I think I just died. And I said, is this the death bardo? Is this like, where I went when I almost died that one night? And they looked at me and said, yeah, more or less so. And then I was like, okay, so if I've been here thousands of times, this could be some sort of death bardo. Like maybe this is God. Like maybe this entity that I'm talking to is the thing that I talked to that one night, gave me this information.
Mm.
And so I asked it, I said, are you God? Are you the entity or whatever that gave me information when I had that near death experience? And, they just looked at me and said, more or less so. And I mean, it was a total trickster archetype that I was confronting. And I came back from that experience. I remember my friend like shaking me. He was like, just breathe, man. And I remember just taking this huge gasp of air, and it felt like my soul returned to my body. And, the world was just covered in jewels. Everything was shimmering, and it felt like this death and rebirth. And then it turned into a very, very beautiful experience. I mean, it was just so much bliss and love. And that really shifted things for me. And I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this experience. And, people always ask me, do you think those are real entities? Like, what do you believe in there? And there's different ways that I view it. Like, I think to one degree, I think I was kind of replaying this near-death experience, and it helped me to recontextualize my trauma and allowing me to confront this visual representation of whatever that was. Maybe my mind created it. It gave me a sense of comfort. It gave me a sense of, oh, maybe this is what happened to me when I went through that near-death experience. It gave me that visual validation that I've been seeking. So to one degree, I think maybe this was just created in my mind. This was just me recontextualizing my trauma, and that was the healing potential. Then you get onto the weird, like, spiritual transpersonal stuff of like, yeah, maybe those are ancestors. Maybe those were real people. I have no idea. Like, I have no way to validate it or like test it. But
I'm curious, like, when you saw them, was it like you're seeing something that's like really there? Was it kind of imaginal? Was it kind of...
It felt really there. I mean, I was in a different realm, and I was there in that realm with them. So like, I had no body awareness. I blacked out. I didn't even know if I was alive. I thought I was dead.
Amazing story. And you're on a rock in the middle of a trail. Were there other people going by?
Small. It's amazing because that felt like a lifetime. And when I think about that experience, like, it's still like in my body, it's in my memory. Like, I feel like I can go back there and be like, that was really profound. It felt like it lasted an eternity. Like, I thought I was in there for a couple lifetimes. It's like a summer day, and there's a lot of bike riders that go through that, so I'm really surprised nobody came by. They probably would have saw a very bizarre scene of a kid just sitting in the middle of the trail. I don't know what the hell I was doing, but
yeah.
I
wonder though, like, maybe someone bikes by and you're just sitting there on a rock. Like, it could look totally normal too, but like, that's kind of paranoia, right, when you're in that state.
Yeah, totally.
You remember how much you took?
I took around 2 grams.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's good information to share with people. Like, it's an incredibly powerful thing, and you could, you could take a gram, you could take 2 grams. It doesn't, who knows how much it will affect you. There's so many factors, I guess.
Yeah, and I like to think about like something that Stan Grof said, like they're non-specific amplifiers of mental or psychic processes. And, this, like, because when I tell people, they're like, that's not that much. People talk about eating 3-5 grams, and, they're like 2 grams. I don't know. I haven't had that big of a transpersonal experience with that. But I think my psyche was primed for it, right? Like, I've been really chewing on this near-death experience for so many years, and I never had an experience to work through it that way. And I think since that content was so charged in my psyche, and having this vehicle or this catalyst to push me there, it was like, all right, maybe now I'm actually ready to confront a lot of this stuff. And, it wasn't until years later I was also thinking about this story. It's very shamanic, and it's very initiatory as well. Like, when you read some of the anthropological literature about like the shamanic illness, shamanic crisis, you hear about people, the initiates, being torn to shreds by like spirits. Things will eat them, tear them to shreds, and then it's this whole process of being put back together again. And then so when I view that from an anthropological viewpoint, and I go, oh, that sounds like an initiatory crisis as well, and has very shamanic qualities to it. The world all of a sudden having teeth, being shredded into pieces, meeting some sort of entity, and then being put back together again. And so after I had that experience, I completely changed my life. I was like, I came back and said, how the hell could somebody eat something that grows from the earth that produced a near-death experience? And it was so similar from my experience to dying, that I just became so fascinated and said, there is something so weird here. And I mean weird in a mysterious type of way of like, what is going on here? So that's when I came across Rick Strassman's work. I didn't know about Terence McKenna. I didn't know about Rick Strassman. I really didn't know about any of that stuff. And then when I started, and the only reason why I picked up Rick Strassman's book, it wasn't because it was like DMT related. I still didn't understand what DMT was. I was in the bookstore, and the thing that caught my attention was research into near-death experiences and other mystical experiences. I said, I think I need to check this out. And so I started forming all these hypotheses around, Rick Strassman's hypothesis of when you have a near-death experience, it could be this endogenous release of DMT. If you look at the chemical structure of psilocybin, it's pretty much just a tryptamine compound like DMT with an extra group of phosphates attached to it. So that allows it to be processed through the liver, enter the brain blood barrier, and so it's kind of like this orally active dose of DMT. And so I started putting all this stuff together, going like, well, if I took this possibly like orally active dose of DMT and it was very similar to dying, then maybe we do release endogenous DMT when we die, because there's this huge similarity between the two. And so that's what really kind of got me started on the path of wanting to research this more. It's just like, it started to infect me in a way of like, I can't stop thinking about this stuff, because like, I feel like my life is just so turned upside down by this near-death experience and then this psychedelic experience of going, I think I need to devote my life to try and understand this and what's going on here.
It was a real calling.
Yeah. And a calling I push against, because, it's, back then, and still, there's still a little bit of taboo. I know things are loosening up with the research, and, since Michael Pollan's book was released, a lot more people are starting to become more interested. But back then I was like, I don't want to have anything to do with it publicly, because it's kind of like, it's still taboo. It's still illegal. Right.
Yeah, it was a few things that I thought of as you were talking. I mean, one, to get, and we can, final thoughts maybe for now on this idea of right use, but, if I was going to create like a warning label for something like psilocybin mushrooms, it would be that it could have an enormous impact on you potentially from what you might consider to be a small amount. And so, I sometimes in the psychedelic space, and people who are into this world like have a kind of ego about it, like, oh, I did 5 grams last weekend, and 2 grams is whatever, and that's just a terrible attitude. And I think that is where people get into trouble, because you could take a half a gram and it could knock you off your ass, and you have to, so it deserves respect. The other thing I was thinking about is our culture. A lot of cultures have a concept of secrecy, like as part of their, like an initiation is into something that's a little bit secret. It's something that other people who haven't done the initiation don't know or understand. And I think this culture really, for better or worse, I think there's good to it. Like we love to break open taboos. We love to be open. We love to share. And I think it's really healthy to share what's true. But sometimes I wonder about, because I was born and grew up in America, I don't know what it would be like to be in, say, in a more indigenous culture or a different culture, like Asian cultures, where they held things like this and they did hold them kind of secretly, but it wasn't a secrecy of like, this is wrong and you're going to go to hell. It was like a secrecy that was connected with the power of it.
Yeah, this is something that comes up often. It's something that we actually were talking about in our class last round. But I'll go back to that book that you mentioned a little bit earlier, The Immortality Key by Brian Morescu. And so he really kind of goes into the ancient Greek rites, specifically the Eleusinian mysteries, which a lot of scholars have hypothesized that the drink that they drank during that rite could have been a concoction of ergot, which is what LSD is synthesized from. And so those rites went on for about 2,000 years, and it was punishable by death to disclose what happened in there. And so there was that sense of secrecy. And there's one person, Pindar, the Greek poet Pindar, he spoke about it briefly and wrote, "It was dying before dying." And I think there is something interesting there about keeping some of these experiences to yourself. It's almost like maybe some of it loses potency when you release the information. And what is it like to hold on to that a little bit?
Yeah.
I always think about it. It's like how much of my story that I share publicly when I talk about that, like how much of it am I like letting go of the potency or the magic of that experience, versus like keeping it. But there's also a part of it that wants to be shared. It wants to be shared for educational purposes and
Right.
just to highlight the potential danger there. I mean,
Right.
thankfully I got through it, but that could have been, it was really scary. It was really scary. I mean, that shook me up to the point where it was like, I don't know if I ever want to do that again. I got out on the other side and it was really beautiful, but I mean, there was parts where I'm like, hell no, I never want to go back into that state again. That was terrifying.
And that's what makes it an initiation in some ways. Like you really faced
Yeah.
something that was really challenging and really difficult and came through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I know even like you said, you have a Buddhist background, and probably even speaking to Mike Crowley, like even some of those traditions. I remember
Yeah.
chatting with somebody actually that's around your area that studies herbs and Buddhism, and they had all sorts of kind of these secret ingredients to produce these these non-ordinary states, and we were chatting years and years ago about it, but they were talking about the secrecy behind some of these recipes, and it's not to hold on to it and say it's just for us, but I think it's really about the initiation, right? It's like you go through that process, you have your own experience, you develop a relationship with the universe that's sacred to you, and you kind of hold on to that for yourself, right? And then that's you pass the lineage on through kind of
Yeah.
like these initiatory acts.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. In Tibetan Buddhism in particular, or Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism, secrecy is this huge thing. It's a huge part of it, and it really infused Tibetan culture. So Tibetan culture is maybe kind of the opposite of our culture, but there's a way that you can, keep the secrecy and respect that, and still talk about things in a kind of general way. And so that I think that
Yeah.
you kind of do both. I mean, and now with the internet and all the information, I mean, I
It's
think
all out there.
it's all out
Yeah.
there. The Dalai Lama actually spoke about this, and he said the real secrecy is self-secret. The real initiation is recognizing your own true nature, and that's secret from you. It's not like you need to hide that from someone else. I like that. I like
Right.
the way that he's able to bridge some of these gaps and explain things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like it.
But yeah, this for sure a lot of secrecy, and like most of the initiations are even, I guess I would hesitate to say all of them because I don't know, but they're not using psychoactive substances. I mean, Mike Crowley's done research, and maybe in the past they did, and maybe there's some very secret groups that have some tradition of that, but it's more of like supposed to be like a more power of the blessings, and it's more about an inner realization. But perhaps like that book that you just mentioned, The Immortality Key, like maybe in the past psychedelics were a part of that initiation process, and it sounds like they were in ancient Greece. And one area where it doesn't seem controversial to say that is ancient India with soma. That's
Right.
very explicitly recorded in the Vedas that it was a psychoactive drink and was part of it. And so it goes way back. I think part of your story that is so fascinating too is like you took these mushrooms without any preconceptions or ideas, really didn't know what you were doing, and you have this experience that has certain universal characteristics, like the initiation process. It's almost like some of there's like universal aspects to spirituality, to being human, that pop up again and again. It's almost like they're waiting to be unlocked. So it's not like a cultural custom that was passed down to you. It's something that happened to you, and yet there's nothing more human than that story.
And that's like what fascinated me the most. I mean, obviously, I went in with a little bit of context. I mean, hearing friends and, the
Right.
jokes and culture of you eat mushrooms and you see pink elephants or elves or whatever, like you get a little bit of that. But I mean, the thing that like really kind of shattered me was like having that experience. And then hearing Terrence McKenna talk about these self-transforming machine elves. And I just started scratching my head going like, wait a minute, other people have seen these things too. And then hearing like all the reports by like Rick Strassman in his book, and that just is what fascinated me the most, of going like, what's going on here, that people have no context for it, but there's people that encounter similar type of entities. And what is that like, are we tapping into the collective unconscious? Are they just archetypal forces? Like, I mentioned, it was a total trickster archetype. Like, was I confronted with the trickster? And that's just what the mind produces for the trickster archetype. I don't know.
So did you kind of maybe connected that with the machine elves from Terrence McKenna?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, cool.
I mean, when I first heard Terrence, I mean, the first thing I wait, somebody else is seeing these things too? Like, I started scratching my head going like, what's going on here? Like, how could you have this like cross-cultural phenomenon of having shared experiences with similar visions or images, entities? Like, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and it's also not everyone who takes these things has that kind of experience, so it's
No, yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, typically you hear that with like, say, like DMT, smoke DMT, you hear that, but yeah, I don't know.
Interesting. Well, so you're like, this has been your calling, and you've been doing it for a while now, and you're like, do you want to speak to like what do you see? I mean, it seems like we've had mushrooms decriminalized in Denver now, and I know in Portland they're being used in therapy now, right, legally. Like, what do you see happening over the next year, 2, 3 years?
Yeah, it's a question we get asked often. And I think there's, I feel like it's still early to really know because things are shifting so much. So, yeah, for example, like you mentioned, Denver decriminalized psilocybin. Oregon legalized psilocybin therapy. So it's not legal yet. They're still putting together the regulations around it. And so I think they have about like 2 years, well, under 2 years now to get all that approved. But, beforehand, we're thinking about these different use contexts, and the medicalization model has been very dominant in that
Right.
these substances will only be used in kind of like psychiatry and mental health. And so when you go down that path with like MDMA or psilocybin, the big kind of thing within the psychedelic world has been like compass pathways that they had a patent on the synthesis process with psilocybin, and there's this fear that they would have a monopoly over it, and only people that meet a certain mental health criteria will get access, right? Treatment resistant depression with MAPS and the MDMA, for PTSD. And so you have this limited access, and so which is kind of more in that medicalization paradigm. And so that was like really the route. So when people ask like, how do I get involved, how can I become a therapist to do this work, a few years ago I said, well, MAP seems like the only way to get training for MDMA therapy, which is still the path forward for that medicine. With psilocybin, it would have been through, a company like Compass that's like producing their protocols. And then out of left field, right, we're starting to see these more cities have these decriminalization initiatives, which doesn't legalize it, right? Like there's still risk. Mushrooms are still illegal, right? It just removes the penalty. Doesn't mean that the state it's not going to come in to prosecute you, or the feds could come in and prosecute you. So I think we need
to share, right?
Yeah, I think we need to like know what decriminalization actually means. It doesn't mean that it's legal. It just it's stating the lowest priority for law enforcement, and no resources should go towards prosecuting, but the state could come in since these are just city ordinances. But still, with that decriminalization, I think people get excited. So you might see a little boom in the underground of people holding ceremonies, underground therapists, feeling a little bit more protected about offering their services. And then with Oregon, they just kind of, yeah, again, came out of left field and, passed this initiative to legalize psilocybin therapy that also takes it out of, say, the mental health context. So they're calling it like psilocybin services, and you don't necessarily need to meet a certain criteria. And so that kind of shifts things, right? That, somebody that is quote unquote unhealthy can only receive this treatment. Now it might be opening up, and who knows, that might change as they put the regulations together, and you never know with politics. But Compass threw huge opposition towards Oregon, and you look at that and you go, well, wonder why, because I'm sure Compass was really excited to kind of have a monopoly on it for a little bit. So there's a couple other states that are trying to do the same. Hawaii and Florida also want to try to pass an initiative similar to Oregon. So what happens if that law allows producers to grow mushrooms and distribute mushrooms to service clinics where you have trained professionals? And I don't know how the law is written up. I don't think it necessarily needs to be highly clinical. I think people with some sort of training that go through training could be a support person at some of these places, and it really depends. And so I think we're at the we don't really know. I think the medicalization model will try to dominate, and and I think that's going to be good for people that need that context, people that need that level of care and safety. But I mean, what about like religious freedom and spirituality, self-development, and outside of this pathology paradigm of you need to be sick to have healing? What about getting in touch with yourself, having more creativity, connection, right? Getting in touch with the universe in a different way. Yeah. Initiation, right?
I think it's a great point. And I think we could see our culture, society, country go down a road of, like you're talking about, medicalization, where these substances are still very controlled, still very much illegal, but used in certain contexts. I don't think that's the direction we're going in, thankfully. I think more and more people see it as a human rights issue, like a social justice issue. The war on drugs has become kind of seen for what it is, finally. It was like the elephant in the room for so long that it was used to incarcerate so many millions of people, and people don't want that anymore. I think the tide is turning with those things. And I wonder, I think when I think about a world in which these are more available and not illegal, I think that's a good thing overall. And I still think there will be an incredible place for people who are well trained, who have put in the work and the training and hold the skills and can create environments in which people can have really profound, powerful journeys. And that doesn't mean, like, as per our conversation earlier, it doesn't mean that there can be other uses that could also be good and okay and at festivals or whatever, but there's something special that can happen, in the right sun setting.
Totally.
And have people who can hold that space and help facilitate that. And so that's like, it's not like that's going to go away, but yeah, I like the idea of not having one group that's trying to control this thing.
Yeah, and that's where I come back to like these different use contexts and how, as the field grows together, how can we all appreciate these different use contexts? Like myself, being trained as a therapist and really having this, like, my goal set to do psychedelic assisted therapy at some point. Like, I've always felt that's how that should be done, and I've had to do a lot of self-reflection and be like, is that really the only way? Can there be other ways? What part of myself wants it to be dominated by the psychology and psychiatry? There's a big part of me because it feels like job security. It's like, oh, only we get to use these substances, and this is how it should be done. So I've definitely had to do a lot of self-reflection over the years to be like, what are my intentions with this? Why would I want to see it that way? And can I appreciate other like use cases? And I think as the field grows and, you know, these different type of agendas are emerging, we need to have conversations about it and say, hey, listen, like there's lots of people that are going to benefit from the medical model. I'm obviously not, you know, shitting on it. I just, you know, we see some of the limitations with access. I mean, you even see that with mental health care, right? Like people can't get insurance, counseling can be expensive out of pocket. So it's going to be very limiting. And so, yeah, we have to reflect and say, is that always the best thing? Could people find retreat centers beneficial if they're, you know, somewhat healthy, functional, they're able to have a support system, they're able to do it in that context? People that want to have like these religious experiences, and yeah, the clinical model is going to be great for people that need that high level of care, that really want to do some of that deeper inner work. You know, even people that go to these retreat centers and do it in, say, recreational settings, they still will reach out to, you know, mental health professionals to maybe engage in a deeper therapeutic process. And so I think we just need to really understand how people use these, and really respect why people use these substances, and to try to create that landscape for people to choose how they want to use them. And I know that that seems radical to some people, but I think it's also like an honest approach that we need to kind of consider.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a big fan of choice, you know, kind of choice, giving people choice. I just thought of like the medical model. It could look like, you know, therapy or spiritual retreats and all that stuff. It could also look like going to a kind of drab office laboratory, getting an injection of ketamine and lying on a table for 3 hours. And
I don't want
that. But that's like, I've talked to people who've had that experience too. And so, I don't particularly want that either. I really value therapy and process, you know, the process that can, and everything obviously, but there's some people who are more on the I don't want to say cold-hearted, whatever the word is, materialistic side of like, just take this substance and you'll, so it's this whole, we live in a big world with a lot of different opinions. But I read one of the early accounts of one of the people who first took LSD. I think it was like was it like Germany, and like along, you know, back when it was
like Hoffman and like,
back like way back
Switzerland.
Then. And they literally laid on a hard table with like a fluorescent light over their head, and then like some scientists with a notepad like observing them. And
Stan talked about that when they were doing their early research. They would have the strobe light, and it was like to drive brain waves. And Stan talks about taking LSD and having that happen, and you know, having this really. He said he went into that experience as a atheistic Freudian, and he came out as a devotee of Shiva.
So you can transcend whatever setting you're in. I love that story. Yeah, that's exactly the story I was thinking of.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, one other thing I wanted to ask you about while I have you, I just did a training with medicinal mindfulness.
Oh, nice.
I have another podcast or two just about that, but they are using cannabis as a psychedelic sacrament, and I am totally blown away how powerful it is.
It's powerful, yeah.
Yeah, do you want to speak to that? Have you had experience with that?
You know, cannabis has always been very psychedelic to me and very powerful. So, you know, I've definitely learned over the years to be a little bit more intentional with the use. And, you know, I was so glad to connect with Daniel, like however many years ago we connected, maybe like 4 years ago at this point. Because I was like, oh man, I found somebody else that like understands that cannabis can be highly psychedelic. And it really depends on like that set and setting and creating that like that space to have that experience. And so, I think most people think of cannabis, and, you know, it's more of, you know, I think people recreate with it pretty often, so they don't view it. And maybe with that, the tolerance buildup occurs. And so you get those dulled effects over time. But like, really pulling back and thinking about your relationship with the plant. How do you want to engage with it? And, you know, this is more kind of shamanic oriented, right? It's like developing a relationship with the plant spirit. What is that plant spirit telling you? How can you create that set and setting or that ceremonial space to start to develop that relationship with it? And that spirit can show you things, right? Like you can have very deep, profound experiences with plants. You know, just even thinking about, like, I did some herbalism stuff with an Abenaki elder and up in Vermont, and I don't know if it was her or somebody else I was talking to, just talking about plant medicine in general. They're like, if you want to learn about a medicine, you could also, put the medicine under your pillow, and the
Mm.
spirit of that plant will come to you in dreams, and that's how you learn from it. Or, you start developing these rituals behind plants. And so, I guess from my perspective, coming from more of those shamanic type of lineages and experiences, doesn't seem too weird that if you can develop a really profound relationship with cannabis, it can be very psychedelic.
Yeah.
I've had many breakthrough experiences with it, and I find that it aids in really great somatic practice for myself. Actually,
Yeah. You
like
can.
I do a lot of really great somatic release with it, and
Mm.
really kind of go inward. But
Beautiful. Yeah,
yeah,
no, I appreciate your words and thoughts there. I think it definitely can be psychedelic, and I was just blown away at how, I don't even know what words to put to it, how much of a journey effect it was. Like,
yeah. What was your experience like with that?
well, just
If
to
you're
like,
open to sharing.
yeah, I want to share a little bit about it. I mean, I think one of the things that was a big part of it is the music. Like,
Yeah.
Daniel creates amazing music sets, and I have a pretty decent sound system, but I think just headphones would help. So I think that's a part of it, the intentionality, um, kind of the relationship with the plant, creating a blend. But I was totally not expecting it to be what it was. Like it was like taking something like DMT or psilocybin. It was like going on a real psychedelic journey, and that's just, to me, is it's forever changed my relationship and understanding of cannabis and the power and the potential and the beauty there.
Hmm.
And it's, to me, the biggest example in this world, in the world of drugs, or whatever you want to call them, entheogens, of how so many people are missing that potential, or not seeing it, or like the way in which it's used makes such a big difference. So I don't even know how to. I guess I'm still kind of thinking about it, but just, it was so different than, smoking a bowl and watching a movie or talking to a friend or
Right.
something. It was just so different than that. So it's almost like amazing that it was the same thing.
Yeah. Well, and it's like really interesting to think about. So there's two things that came up. One about relationship. I remember I was talking to one of my shamanic practitioner teachers. I was just asking him his thoughts about psychedelics, and he said, I don't know like how it will really unfold here in the West, because in most traditional cultures they have a relationship with the plants, and we typically don't develop relationship with plants.
Right.
So how do we redevelop relationships with plant medicines? I mean, that's just a foreign concept, because they live, like most of those kind of societies lived in more of animistic worldviews. Things are alive, right? I mean, that was something my one teacher kept driving in about, like ancient Greek culture. For Plato and those ancient Greeks, like everything was animate, everything was alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't live in that worldview
Right.
anymore. So having that like relationship just seems
Yeah.
weird. It's like, what do you mean a plant has a spirit? It's very, very weird. But the second thing that came up is that I don't know if you ever had any experience with holotropic breath work, but
Mm.
I mean, that blew me away.
Right.
I said, how the hell could you have an experience by just breathing and full on, like, I relived all sorts of crazy stuff, like my near death experience, that really profound psilocybin experience. And it was so profound. And so something like
Yeah.
coming from like I guess my teacher's philosophical viewpoint is that all the experience is inside of us, right? And these are just vehicles to amplify experience, whether
Right.
it's cannabis, breathwork, psychedelics, it's all inside anyways. And so if we can create that container to amplify our internal experience, it's all there, it's all accessible. So really, I view a lot of these as tools and allies and amplifiers of experience at times.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. It's within us. It's amplifying that. I guess I just want to add, just thinking about this experience, it's called the Psychedelic Sitter School with Medicinal Mindfulness, and Daniel McQueen was teaching it and talking about the relationship with cannabis. So I grew cannabis plants last summer, And it wasn't really about trying to get a bunch of flower or whatever. It was about developing this relationship and spending time with them. And it was a interesting experience. Like I could feel the vibrancy, the power, the way they turn towards the sun, the green, the way they would respond to the watering and nutrients, and just being with them. And it's cool. I was thankful I live in Colorado. I got to do that. It's kind of like a little experiment or hobby. It's not like a professional thing. And then before this training using cannabis as a sacrament, like I went to a dispensary here in Boulder that is 100% organic. They take a lot of care. I talked with the people that work there, and I chose some strains that spoke to me and that were recommended. And so there were all these, as I think about it, talking about it with you, like there's been a lot of things in my life kind of preparing me for that. It wasn't like just a random thing with like a bag of whatever I bought off the street corner. It was like a lot of intentionality. And then I've been studying traditional Tibetan medicine. Cannabis is listed, as a medicine in traditional Tibetan medicine, like for 1,200 years at least. So there's been a connection I've been developing in that way, like seeing it as a medicine, making offerings, saying prayers, some traditional like medicine Buddha prayers with it. And I think all those things, like they matter, like they do make a difference. Like that's where I'm at. I mean, some people listening, you can believe what you want, but for sure my experience, just my own subjective experience would be different minus any of those variables, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I am curious, like, from your perspective, studying Buddhism, like, where is that split there, right? Because they talk about it, but also from maybe like a drug perspective, it's, taboo, you shouldn't use it.
Totally taboo.
Bad for meditation.
Yeah. I think that I am, people talk about coming out a psychedelic, like coming out of the closet, similar to like with sexual orientation. I think that there is a tidal shift that I'm starting to sense in the Buddhist world. And it's something I've struggled with for years, actually, is a sense of guilt, a sense of shame, a sense of this is wrong if you're a meditator, that it could detract from your spiritual path. And I understand why teachers give those warnings. There's a huge amount of culture at play. It's a big conversation. But when a Tibetan Lama travels from Asia and comes to this country, and they're not giving a lecture about how cannabis can be used as a medicine. They're telling people, a lot. They are maybe buying into some of the stereotypes, or maybe it's just a different cultural context that influences them too. But then, even within the Buddhist world, part of what complicates the picture is monasticism. So, if you want to look at Buddhism, like monks and nuns, monasticism has been a dominant force, and it's been a huge bedrock of the tradition. It's what's helped preserve the tradition. And at the same time, in Tibet and India and places where it was deeply rooted, there were a lot of lay practitioners, there were doctors, there were tradesmen, there were townspeople who were also meditating, who were also having spiritual experiences and insights and realizations, and who hadn't taken those vows. So I think that's a part of the story. And then but just culturally, in this culture, we have drugs, and then we have things that aren't drugs. And that's a Western modern concept, that there were no prisons, there were no police arresting people for stuff in Tibet 1,000 years ago. And so I'm for sure they would probably, you can read ancient warnings like don't get drunk all the time. Like that's kind of obvious, right? But they didn't. And the other thing is, just to keep going with the cannabis example, but like ketamine or cocaine or all these, we have this huge pharmacopoeia that traditional cultures didn't have access to in the same way. And the kind of cannabis that we have now, 20, 30% THC.
Definitely different.
Right? All the different strains that have developed. So it's a totally different thing, I think. And so I don't really even give too much weight to cannabis being a traditional Tibetan medicine, because I think what they have in Tibet traditionally is very different than what we can get
so
here.
Different, yeah.
That's kind of my long-winded thoughts on it.
Cool. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's interesting, I guess, like how cannabis has evolved over the years. I mean, it definitely is way more psychoactive than it was, right?
Yeah. It's a powerful plant. It really feels almost alien or something, like it's evolved. Like human beings, we evolve and change really fast. And it's like this plant has kind of been like, all right, guys, I'm going to like keep up with you. And it's changed, and it's so variable, and there's so many all the uses and all the different ways it can look and effects it can have.
Well,
And
it's interesting too, and just thinking about like how highly stressed the plant is, being that it's like female and like it's THC is like one of those sex hormones, right? It's
oh,
like
that's interesting. Yeah,
trying to
trying to reproduce.
yeah, and you know, you're taking all the males away so you don't produce all those seeds, right? And so yeah, it's I don't know. I've had lots of thoughts about just the way cannabis is being produced and how you know it might be a very stressed plant at times when you think about taking it out of its natural environment like that to produce high yield, high THC content with no seeds.
Yeah. Well, that's to that point. I specifically bought non-feminized seeds when I grew, and if you buy feminized seeds, they're guaranteed to be female, but the plant is there's some process where they really stress the plant and really kind of torture it, and it forces it to make just female seeds. So, yeah, that's a whole conversation. I mean, that's like everything our culture kind of interacts with is this exploitative kind of trying to get the most out of it, trying to make money off of it, trying to,
Yeah.
and so it's all kind of mixed together. It's a complex world.
I had this conversation with my teacher last night actually, and I know this kind of comes from Michael Pollan. I know he's kind of hypothesized this as well, but he was talking about his experience like down in the Amazon a little bit, and we were talking about psychedelics, and you know, he's like, you know, from if you come from that culture down there, like you don't need to drink ayahuasca to realize that like, you know, nature's alive. But then, you know, I was asking him just about like, you know, the plant's intelligence, and I forget what the question I asked, but he's like, you know, who's really in charge here? You know, are we consuming the plant or is the plant using us? Right. And I think that was also like Michael Pollan's like
Yeah.
botany of desire. It's like we are kind of almost like servants to the plants at times. Like, and we don't even know it. Right. It's like, oh, like it's, you know, producing these certain flowers, these scents, and it's trying to co-evolve with us. And yeah, we don't even maybe realize the interdependence and the connections that we have.
Right.
And,
Right.
you know, maybe we are kind of like helping plants do certain things and we don't even know it.
No,
We think
absolutely.
we're consuming it. It's like our experience, right?
Yeah, we're so human centric and human centered.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard this story. I forget the details, but there was an indigenous like shaman or medicine man, and it was asked like, "What is the most powerful plant or powerful substance?" And he said tobacco, and they were like, "What? Really? Tobacco? That doesn't seem like that big of a deal." And he's like, "Look how many people it's smoking. Like the plant is smoking the people."
Oh,
And like
interesting.
kind of
Yeah, right.
taking their lives, honestly, right? It's taking their lives.
Yeah. Fascinating perspective to
Yeah.
think about, right?
Well, to come back to that question of addiction, like when you're really in the grips of an addiction, you feel like you're being used by something that's outside of yourself, kind of like.
Outside of you, yeah.
Yeah. So that when we talk about spirits and medium entities, like they're not always going to be positive. Maybe sometimes they are wanting to use us.
Yeah, and then I guess like I don't know, this is something Joe and I talk about on the show often, just about psychology. Like, how do we contain these experiences from like a Western perspective when they have experiences like this in the clinical setting? You know, like I remember when Rick Strassman was talking about this back in 2010, he said, you know, I haven't talked about much of the research. I think he said in like 15 years when he was presenting, just because of like how much it shook him up, of like people coming back and reporting this like transpersonal phenomenon, and how as like clinicians, therapists, like maybe starting to hold space for people coming back saying like, I had an experience with Mother Ayahuasca, I had an experience with like these entities, like, you know, how is like our Western frameworks like gonna really hold that, contain it? You know, do we pathologize it and say these are hallucinations, right? Or are we saying, hey, maybe there's something else here? And so yeah, I don't know, I'm just interested in, you know, how do we like, I don't know, either recreate these narratives, this paradigm, how do we integrate some of these old traditions with some of the newer science, and
Yeah.
really kind of recreating it, because I wonder like what type of like impact it's going to have. And I always come back to like what happens when, a society gets like, exposed to this on a mass scale. Like, is there going to be like an increase in spiritual emergencies? Do we have the cultural frameworks to contain these experiences? Or, are we just going to try to, write them off and try to suppress the experiences if they feel really big, or kind of like, psychotic like? Because people can have some of these really dark type of experiences on psychedelics, right? And do we have a framework for it?
Absolutely, yeah, big questions. I think obviously our culture will try to make money with it, but like you're speaking to, like the experience themselves, the subjective experience, the human experience, the personal thing that happens will be something that goes way beyond all that. So it almost like doesn't even matter to me. But I really think that our culture is going to, and this is kind of out of left field. Like I don't have any evidence for this. This is just my intuition. I really think that this culture is going to develop initiation process for people who are 16 or 17 or 18 or 19, whatever. It doesn't matter to me what the age is. It's not about that. It's about how do we go from being a child to being an adult. How do we have a taste of something beyond the ego, beyond personal life, that sense of that deathless quality? And how do we imbue our culture with significance and the sacred? Like that sense of the sacred. Like I think America is a very young culture, right?
It is.
They're super, super, super young. It's not going to sustain, it's not going to last without rooting into something bigger. And that's what, part of the function of spirituality, of religion is. And we don't have that right now. We live in this fractured world where everyone is in their own reality and we can't agree on anything. And we don't have things that bring us all together. And the power of an entheogen, a psychedelic, to give everyone who partakes their own experience, whatever that is, I think that's gonna change the world. I think it is changing the world, but
yeah. And I just I love that topic. I wrote a paper during my undergrad in one of my eco-psych classes on the importance of rites of passages. And there are definitely a few things that stuck out from some of these quotes, but I remember one just saying like how childish Western culture is, like maturity level without the rites of passages. And how do we find, we're like recreating our own rites of passages all the time, joining gangs or, engaging in risky behavior without any sort of container. And it's like we're this culture that we keep engaging in these initiatory acts, but don't have a container with, and when we do explore that, you either get in trouble, you get shamed, and there's like, negative consequences, right? Somebody goes off to college, they drink, you get underage drinking violation, or, all these different kind of like things that could be negative by you just engaging in an initiatory act. And we just don't have the container to hold it and say, hey, this is part of growing up and being human. How do we teach you how to navigate this with more safety?
And how to have a shared experience, with other people, and have elders. That sense of having elders that can come from that. I think. Yeah. I don't know. I wasn't expecting to go here with this conversation, but I think it's cool to reflect on.
I love it. Yeah.
I think you could 100%, absolutely, you could have an initiation. You could have these experiences without the use of a substance. That's almost, to me, not the point. The point is, how do we connect with something bigger than ourselves? How do we connect with each other? How do we care about each other? How do we get beyond our little concerns for a moment and have something that kind of marks a new phase, a new chapter? I think that's very human.
Yeah, I think there could be huge potential there. I remember, and again, it doesn't need to be psychedelics. I mean, we look at traditional rites of passages. There's many different techniques to go through that. But I remember somebody pitching this idea of like a psychedelic summer camp. Of like an initiatory camp where you kind of go through this rites of passage. But I think it's something that's missing out of our culture, and I think some of us that we're all looking for at times, and we're finding it in other like actions and behaviors. And
right.
We don't have these elders stepping in saying, maybe this is how it's done, or this is how to develop a healthy relationship with these things.
Yeah, it makes me think too, like going to a therapist, a psychologist for a period of time could be that for someone. It could
Yeah.
be kind of birthing process, honestly. Well, it's been great having you on the podcast. It's a rich conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Julian. I've
Fun to follow.
appreciated it. Yeah.
Do you have any other last thoughts for us?
No, I've just really enjoyed this. We went all over the board a little bit, but I just always encourage people to stay curious. Stay curious about your own process and stay curious about life. It's pretty cool. I always like to reflect, like talking about psychedelics. Like psychedelics are interesting, but life is very hell of a lot interesting. Like waking up and just knowing that you're here, you have a body, and we're on this like just rock floating through space. I mean, what is more psychedelic than that? I don't know. It's pretty wild to really think about. So I'll leave it with that. And yeah, if anybody wants to follow us over at Psychedelics Today, you can find our podcast at Psychedelics Today on most of the podcast apps, psychedelicstoday.com. And then if you want to check out my personal site, that's settingsunwellness.com as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Stay curious. I love that message.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about my work as a psychotherapist, meditation teacher, coach, public speaker, and all of that, I have a brand new website that I am excited to share. It is astateofmindcounseling.org. And if you'd like to support this podcast, we do have a Patreon page, patreon.com/astateofmind. Become a member, become a subscriber. Got some benefits coming out for you guys. And another way to support the show is just to share it with friends, with family, to post about it on your own social media accounts. All those are great ways to support the show as well. Thank you so much, and I will see you here next time.